Welcome back. This is the second screencast covering evolution from Chapter 27. Some people believe that God created all organisms exactly as we see them today. Another explanation is that new species can evolve from pre-existing species. Let's look at lines of evidence that support the hypothesis that species evolve. One type of evidence is homologous structures. These structures are anatomically and developmentally similar. They indicate a common ancestry. In contrast, analogous structures appear similar superficially and may have the same function, but developmentally and anatomically they are distinctly different and do not indicate a common ancestry. For example, vertebrates are animals with backbones. In their forelimbs they all show a similar pattern of one bone, two bones, and then several bones. If you're familiar with human anatomy, you can easily identify these same bones in other mammals as well. These are examples of homologous structures. In contrast, a bird's wing and a butterfly wing, while they both enable the organism to fly, are analogous. They are not homologous structures. Let's look at a different line of evidence. Many different organic molecules have been used to investigate the ancestry of organisms. DNA is one example. The basic assumption is that closely related organisms should share much of the nucleotide sequences on their DNA in common. For example, humans and chimpanzees share a large amount of their DNA. Proteins have also been used to compare interrelatedness among organisms. Let's try a completely different line of evidence. Biogeography. This looks at where organisms live now and where they have lived in the past, and it can be used as evidence for common ancestry. The discovery of continental drift helped explain many confusing ancient distributions. For example, identical fossils were found in South America and in Africa. We now know at one time these continents were connected. Ontogeny is the developmental history of an individual. It's been used to investigate the relationships among organisms. However, ontogeny does not illustrate the step-by-step evolutionary history of a taxon. Related species share similar embryonic development. However, mammal embryos do not go through the same phylogeny, in other words, their evolutionary history, that would illustrate a fish stage, a reptile stage, etc. Let's try something very different. Hardy and Weinberg came up with what's now called the Hardy-Weinberg law, which identifies the conditions necessary for the frequency of alleles within a population to remain constant. If allele frequencies remain constant, then a population cannot evolve. They identified 5 different conditions that must be met if allele frequencies will not change. Their conditions were: mutations don't persist in populations. In other words, they're all harmful. Mating has to be random among individuals of the same species. Individuals don't move easily from one population to another. This is called gene flow. Random chance doesn't have an important effect on allele frequencies. This is called genetic drift. And then finally, natural selection cannot occur. In other words, all individuals have to have equal chances of surviving and reproducing. As biologists have investigated populations, they have found numerous violations to these conditions. Beneficial mutations do sometimes occur. In many populations, mating is not random. In some species, individuals do easily move long distances between populations. In small populations, genetic drift due to random events can be significant, but it's usually not important in larger populations. And finally, natural selection does occur. Individuals do not have equal opportunities to survive and to reproduce. Let's look now in more detail at natural selection. Natural selection is a mechanism for evolution which was developed independently by Charles Darwin and Alfred Wallace. They were not the first people to suggest that organisms change over time, but they were the first to come up with a mechanism. In natural selection, populations are capable of exponential growth. But what Darwin and Wallace observed was that most populations remain relatively stable in size. Let's look at an example of exponential growth. Let's assume I'd like to hire you for 30 days. I'll pay you 1 cent the first day and then double your salary each day after that. Would you like the job? If money's important to you, you certainly would. So again, you started out with just 1 cent for your salary for the first day. The second day, 2 cents. The next day, 4 cents, and so on. Your salary grew very slowly at first, but towards the end of the month it went zooming upwards, and you're now a multimillionaire. This is an example of exponential growth. Populations are also capable of similar growth. While populations are capable of growing exponentially, they don't continue. And that's because at some point a necessary resource becomes in short supply, and a struggle for existence results as individuals compete for that limited resource. Darwin and Wallace also realized that individuals within a population are not identical. They show variation in their characteristics. These characteristics can be passed from parents to offspring. In other words, they're genetically determined. Darwin and Wallace argue that these variations would affect an individual's ability to survive and to reproduce. As a result, characteristics which make individuals better adapted to the conditions tend to accumulate in the population, and the population evolves, eventually producing new species. In a population, there's often a bell-shaped distribution curve showing the range of variation for a given characteristic. For example, size. A few members of the population will be larger than average, a few will be smaller than average, but most individuals tend to fall somewhere in the middle. If there's an advantage to being larger, for example, over time the population should shift to larger and larger individuals. This is an example of directional selection, and one example of it is seen in horses. But natural selection isn't always directional. In this example, a snail species varies from darker to lighter in coloration, and lives in both sunlit and shady habitats. In the shadier habitat, the darker individuals have a better survival rate. In the sunnier habitat, the light-colored individuals do better. As a result, disruptive selection occurs, tending to separate the population into two different groups. Finally, natural selection can also be stabilizing. In this example, larger and smaller babies are at somewhat of a disadvantage. As a result of this ranging characteristic, the ranging characteristic, in this case birth weight, becomes narrower. Today, most babies born weigh between 7 and 8 pounds. Speciation is the evolution of a new species. Allopatric speciation occurs in geographically separate populations. Sympatric speciation occurs without the geographic isolation. Allopatric speciation occurs when populations of the same species become geographically isolated due to some barrier, like a mountain range, a river, etc. While isolated mutations occur in one population, they're not easily transferred to the other. And also the selective pressures can be different, resulting in different adaptations being favored from one population to the next. Gradually, the populations become more and more distinct, to the point where they're considered to be separate species, and even if they do come back together, they cannot interbreed. With sympatric speciation, there is some other isolating mechanism, something other than geographic separation. It might be a change in color, a change in when they breed, a change in behavior or chromosome number. There's lots of different examples. Whatever might influence which individuals are selected as mates and how successful they are in mating can result in sympatric speciation. Adaptive radiation occurs when a species arrives in an area where lots of ecological opportunities exist. The species then gives rise to several different lineages. Darwin's finches are a nice example of adaptive radiation. It's thought that a single finch species made it to the Galapagos Islands. There were no other similar birds present on the islands, and the finches quickly adapted and evolved to fill several different ecological roles. These roles are sometimes called niches. On the Galapagos Islands, we see tree finches. Some of them specialize in eating seeds, some large seeds, others small seeds. Others specialize in eating insects. We also see some variation similar to those in the tree finches found in ground finches. A remarkable number of different species resulted, all from a single ancestor. Darwin's finches are just one example of a line of evidence that Darwin used in solidifying his ideas on natural selection. Darwin and many others have assumed that evolution proceeds at a slow, steady pace as new characteristics gradually accumulate, leading to new species. Darwin realized that there were gaps in the fossil record. He assumed that as more fossils were found, these gaps would be filled in. As we have learned more about fossils, some gaps still persist. Stephen Jay Gould proposed that these gaps were real and reflected periods of rapid speciation, and therefore missing links would be unlikely to be fossilized. Depending on the species and the characteristics we're looking at, both of these mechanisms are probably at work. With the advent of computers and new statistical analysis tools, biologists have attempted to develop objective ways of investigating evolution, the evolution of living organisms. Many different lines of evidence are used in modeling the phylogenies. Phylogeny remembers the evolutionary history. Intelligent design offers alternative explanations for how life came to be. There are many different ideas, so it's hard to generalize. Basically, they all suggest that life is too complex to have evolved by chance. Instead, proponents believe that a creator had to be involved. They just don't believe that more complex systems can evolve from simpler ones. Some people would like for intelligent design to be taught with or instead of evolution in public schools. My own personal opinion, I don't think intelligent design is science. I don't think it should be taught as a science. This ends chapter 27.